And welcome again to All Things Conflict, where this week my guest is Ed Weeks, who is a partner in the law firm Cripps, and he specialises in dispute resolution in family businesses. And I'm so delighted to welcome him to share his knowledge and his wisdom and the pros and the pitfalls of family businesses and all the complexities that sit underneath that when things go wrong. So let's jump in. Ed, welcome to All Things Conflict. Thank you for giving up some time and talking us through your specialism. So you're a partner actually at Cripps LLP solicitors, and your specialism is family businesses. And of course, this is called All Things Conflict. So I'm rather hoping that we can have a good conversation about, the very niche area of the kinds of conflicts and upsets and disputes that go on in family businesses.
Indeed, yes. A conflict is my line of business. So I started out as a general litigation lawyer. And quite a few years ago, I moved into doing more shareholder disputes, internal business disputes. And more recently, over the last 10 years or so, I've become very specialized in the area of family business disputes, which have a unique flavor about them and some unique issues in relation to them, which make them very complex, but also interesting to resolve.
Yeah, thank you. I can imagine. So I wondered if you might be able to give us some, examples of the types of disputes or conflicts that make things much more complex when it's family members.
Yes, well, the sources of disputes are similar to the sort of disputes you get in ordinary businesses, but a bit different because of the family structure. And those that are particularly prevalent in family businesses are cross-generational disputes. And that can extend into lifetime disputes, but also succession disputes, planning for succession, and post-death disputes around how a business has been left. A particular one that I seem to do a lot of is sibling rivalry. So disputes between siblings. More often than not, it's brothers, by nature of the fact that still in this day and age, most businesses tend to be owned and run by men. So it's most often that I come across brothers in dispute, although I have come across mixed siblings, sisters and brothers, and sisters versus sisters. It's more usually brother versus brother. And another fertile source of disputes in family businesses is a falling out between those that do and those that just take money, because quite often, as you get to second or third generation, the shares will be split amongst quite a number of people. Some of them will be in the business, some of them will just be sitting there with shares. And as my mother would put it, the grunters, the ones that did the work, resent the grunters are the ones that just sit there and moan about things, and the shovers, the ones that put their shoulder to the wheel and do the work. There's an inherent tension between the two of them that can come out in disputes, as well as the standard business disagreements that you're always going to get in any business. But even they have a particular flavor about them when it's family that are falling out about these things. So there's quite a few ways in which being a family business generates a particular kind of conflict.
So you've got the intergeneration also and succession issues, and then and maybe even, before thinking about succession, just the tension between generations and worldviews. And then you've got siblings, and then you've got those that are doing and those that are just, sitting there with their shares. But I guess what makes it more complex is that they take it home with them, and there's it spreads beyond just the people in the workplace who don't know each other and go home to their own respective families where they can spread whatever gossip they want, but it doesn't harm across the extended family lines. I mean, maybe you could speak about that.
Well, I mean, absolutely, and it's a very different thing when these disputes are bleeding into the family and into family events and weddings and big get-togethers can be deeply affected by the business stuff that's going on, and the business stuff can be the source of a major falling out, or conflict within the business can be as a result of a major falling out. The falling out can be inside or outside of the business itself, but have an impact on the business. But certainly, the interconnection between family and home life and the business life is so much more intense in a family business than it is in an ordinary business. Although, having said that, for many non-family businesses that get involved with disputes, the parties involved, it is such an important part of their life, because I tend to work for small, medium-sized enterprises, so it's owner-managed businesses, and they spend more time with their business partner than they often do with their wife and their children. Or again, I say wife and children because it tends to be men in most of the time that I'm acting for. So in many respects, it's an accentuation of something that already exists, that the involvement and stress of being in an owner-managed business bleeds into your family life in a way which is accentuated in the family business, and the tentacles go much wider in the family business.
Yeah, certainly. I'm reminded of a very small business, actually, and I'd be interested in your take on it, where they were two families, two husbands and wives, with their respective children, and the two men decided to go into business with each other. And I think one or both of the wives was going to work in the business, and then once they'd bought the business and put all their money in and decided, one of the partners realised that he'd actually signed something that left him in a much worse position than the other partner. He hadn't really checked. He'd left all the finances in the hands of the other partner, who decided that he actually wasn't going to do any work at all. So he wanted his partner, who was in a worse position, to do all the work, and he just wanted to take a percentage of the proceeds.
And that unfortunately is something you sometimes see, where one party in a business is more savvy when it comes to the documentation or the finances than the other, and you end up with a lopsided arrangement, which is potentially unfair to one party, and that is one of the biggest issues in all businesses, and in particular in family businesses, is around trust. And in the scenario you described, obviously there was a degree of trust there. The person who ended up in the adverse situation trusted the other that his position would be looked after, and that breach of trust is undoubtedly a source of really, really deep conflict and deep disputes if somebody feels that their trust has been breached in that way. And within family businesses, there is a broader sense of trust that I'll be looked after because it's a family business, and I trust my brother or my father or my sister to run things properly, and I don't need to check up on them because they're family. And then you find that they've been taking decisions without reference to people, or they find they've been helping themselves to money out of the business, overpaying salary, paying themselves they shouldn't be paying their home expenses out of the business, all these sort of things you'll sort of see. And that has breached the trust of the others in family in particular. And that's when disputes can really blow up, and they can be very, very hard to then steer back onto a course where you can resolve those disputes, because there's so much emotion flowing around because of that breach of trust.
Yes, and I know in that case, then the guy who was in the lesser position suddenly decided, well, I'm not going to do any work then, and then that risked everything. And it was really interesting to help this family and the other family to walk through the mistakes they'd made, and actually to start, to start saying it's one thing to say, well, I trusted you. And then it's another thing to say, well, at what point did you not take responsibility, because you're dealing in really serious stuff here? And interestingly enough, I could socialise with you for years and we could know each other on all sorts of levels. And then suddenly we bring money into the mix and I don't know you and you don't know me.
And that's absolutely right. And uh, as as a lawyer, I spend a lot of time trying to find ways so that people never have to come to me. Because if you come to me, it's because you're in trouble, and I'm the lawyer of last resort. I deal with things when they've gone really really wrong, and I and my colleagues will regularly say, well, what you need to do is get the documentation sorted at the beginning, get a shareholders agreement in your business, get a family constitution set up, which says uh, and the who does what, and what the non-working shareholders, perhaps they get slightly lower dividends, restructure the shares, find a way to make distribution of the rewards from the business fairer within the different parties, and document all of that at the beginning. And the problem is that nobody ever does, or very very few people do, because they feel it's rather like a prenuptial agreement. It's not very romantic, and it shows a lack of trust
Yeah.
in the parties they're going into business with. And you see that in a non-family business, but even more so in a family business. Why do I need a shareholders agreement? These are my brothers. These are my sisters. This is my father, my parents. We don't need a shareholders agreement. But if you have a shareholders agreement, if things break down, it provides a structure and a mechanism to resolve things. Without that, you're just thrown into the general scheme of litigation or other dispute resolution, and there is no pre-agreed mechanism as to how you're going to sort things out.
And yeah, and it's not even really a matter of, oh, I trust you and you trust me. No one can predict what's going to happen next week, next month, next year, how our positions could change, our access to money could change, our marriages could change, all sorts of things could change, which would then make me want to review how I'm leading my life. But if we have an agreement, then I can say, well, that I need to be true to.
Absolutely. But it's a human failing to want to think about things going wrong. And there's an old adage about the difference between corporate lawyers and litigation lawyers. And when they look at an agreement, a corporate lawyer is looking at the agreement about the number at the front, what everybody's going to earn from all of this. That's the bit sort of they look at. When I read an agreement, I start from the back. I start with the jurisdiction clause and I start with the dispute resolution clause, because I'm thinking about what happens if it all goes wrong. And few people want to think about what happens when it all goes wrong, because particularly when you're setting up a business or you're joining a family business, it's all really exciting and enthusiastic and positive. Nobody wants to sit down and think, well, what happens if this changes, or if we fall out, or this happens? Just don't want to talk about it. So it doesn't get talked about. You don't have a shareholders agreement. You don't have a mechanism to resolve things.
It's really it feels so simple, and yet so many people fail to attend to this part of doing business.
It is, but it is human nature. So many people don't make a will, and the effect of not making a will is really really quite serious in terms of how things might get inherited, and the tax that you'll have to pay on it, and the disruption that can be caused by doing that. So there is no good reason to not make a will, but still people don't do it. And to have something which is even less obviously bad in terms of not making a shareholders agreement it's persuading people it's a good idea is very, very difficult.
Yes, prevention, rather than cure. There's never any time to build the house, but there's always enough time if it falls down, to fix it. So okay, so let me, when we chatted, I realised that what you'd done is you developed this kind of hybrid model of helping people through these kinds of conflicts. And so let's imagine you've got a family business, a few siblings, perhaps an elder, and they've all fallen out with each other over something. I mean, you could make up a scenario, and one of them calls you. How are you going to take them through? They've got no shareholders agreement. Everything was done off the pat, and now suddenly something has changed for somebody, and it's created ripples across the family. How would you look after that? What would your methodology be, without giving away your trade secrets, of course? But
the simple starting point is nearly always the same, which is there is many ways that this can be resolved. Probably the worst way is to go to court, because that will be very, very expensive. It'll take 2 to 3 years out of your life, with all the stress that comes from that and diversion of your energies and attention away from the business itself. And it's an incredibly blunt instrument. It's very much an all or nothing solution in terms of the kind of remedies you can get. So the focus has to be on doing a deal and compromising and coming to an arrangement, a settlement that everybody can live with. And that is the fundamental approach that I will always take in that kind of case. Now, there are occasions where you cannot find that deal, you cannot find that settlement, and you try everything, and then litigation is the only outcome. And then you switch into a slightly different mode, and it's much more transactional and a process to take it through to the end. But the winning the argument bit, which is why I thought I'd become a lawyer, because it's all about winning an argument, putting forward the best case and winning it. That's the sort of the litigation, the process side. But that's not the really important thing about what I do. You have the arguments and you have them to hand, and that's the context which you then seek to negotiate within. And the other side will put forward their arguments and their position, and that's more context. And then within that, you seek to find a solution to resolve that conflict in a constructive way. And that's the real challenge, and what I find really, really fascinating is to find that route to resolve that conflict.
And what do you think that takes? How do you take an entrenched position, and are the other people coming with their own lawyers, or have they come to you?
Yeah, most of them. I will be on one side. I'm not a mediator. I don't sit in the middle. I very much am on one side. But from my perspective, the best thing I can do for my client is to help them get to a deal with the other party, because that is the best outcome. They may or may not get a better monetary outcome by pursuing a claim. They could be in a much, much worse situation by pursuing a legal claim if they lose, and they could be bankrupted by it and whatever. But the real benefit and the real achievement for me is to get them to a deal so that they can resolve things and all move on. And in order to do that, there are various mechanisms that you use. And so you have informal discussions and perhaps some slightly structured negotiation, usually with the lawyer on the other side. And you might, depending on who the lawyer is, you might be able to have a telephone conversation with them, or a Teams meeting to just talk through what the issues are and see if there's any common ground. Is there anything that looks like a potential deal here that we could then talk about and go back to our respective clients and try? More often than that, not. It's more complex often can be solved by that. So you need to maybe go on to more facilitated negotiations and probably onto a formal mediation. And I'm an enormous fan of mediation, getting a neutral intermediary into the equation whose job it is to find a settlement and structure things and use their skill set to bring the parties together. And it's only if that fails do we then really go on to litigation. And in order to make any negotiation or mediation succeed, it's all about understanding the psychology of all of the parties involved. And that's one of the bits that I've found more and more fascinating over the years, because that's not what you're trained as a lawyer to do. And this is just something I've learned on the job over the last 20, 30 years. And to me, it's become the most important feature resolving disputes in family businesses is understanding that psychology.
So I guess I'm being really curious here and perhaps like pushing you a little bit, but can you think about, if you've been doing this for a long time, so you've probably sat with many people, is there an ingredient? You said understanding, but that pivotal moment when you see the ice break, or could you characterize that in some way?
There isn't, and I think there's a uniqueness to every family business dispute, right, which makes it very difficult to say that there's a single thing, a single magic bullet that I can point to, or an element. But it tends to be digging down, right, digging down and listening, really listening to your client, to the opponent's solicitor, and picking up on all sorts of different little cues that you get from them. And sometimes you do have a little light bulb moment, that the way a client says something, or the way when you realize they keep repeating something, which doesn't seem very important, but they keep repeating it. And you think, well, why do they keep repeating this? And then you sort of get to the bottom of it. And it is quite often in the things that I do, stuff that goes back to childhood. And it will be that I discover that I'm acting for the favored child. And on the other side is the child that seemed to have been less favored, or at least felt that they were less favored by their parents, and perhaps got a slightly lesser job within the family business, or didn't get quite the same level of shareholding. And you sort of suddenly realize, well, actually, much of the way in which they are interacting and what is making this difficult to get them to talk properly and come to a deal is because of that dynamic. And that dynamic is something that you then have to factor in to how you're approaching settlement. So if I'm acting for the favored child, I will need to sort of talk to them without being, because you can't, as a lawyer, it's not my business to delve into a family psychology. So you have to approach it quite carefully. So without overtly saying you're the favored child, and you need to give a bit to the other sibling who's feeling aggrieved since childhood that you've always got more from the parents, but you need to sort of talk about them being magnanimous, talk about them giving something, and showing that they somehow understand that perhaps the distribution in the business was a little unfair, and perhaps now they can do something to help that. Just a gesture as much as anything, and that can change the whole dynamic then of the discussion. If the less favored child can see that something is happening, that there's a movement towards them, and a recognition somehow that this was the case. And sometimes it can be more overt, but quite often it's quite subtle, just to identify that this is the block, and then try and work with the parties to do that.
Yeah, that's so insightful. And it reminded me of something years ago where there were five siblings, all grown up, and of the five, four were in dispute and two sides. So four of them, two taking sides against each other, and this other sibling who, to all intents and purposes, was trying to supposedly be the kind of go between, you know, and it took me a while, but actually what I recognised, and you said as a lawyer, it's not your job to go into the psychology. But for me, I started to notice that actually the one who was supposedly not in dispute was actually in that person's interest to keep the dispute going, because they were then the golden person to the elderly parents. And it took quite a lot of digging to really recognise that actually the person who looked like they were the most reasonable and rational and logical and helpful was actually, it was not in their interest for it to resolve. It gave them a role and a job and the leading role in the family dynamic.
Absolutely, and yeah, if that family dynamic wasn't there, that role wouldn't exist.
Yes.
It wouldn't exist in a normal business.
Yes.
But in a family business where the parental approval or disapproval is an important factor, then it is something completely unique to a family business, that kind of dynamic. And if you don't pick up on it, you'll never understand why this dispute is being perpetuated.
Yes, I suppose there's a level of emotional blackmail that can go on in a family that perhaps can't penetrate quite so much in where there are not those kinds of family relationships at stake. Would that be fair to say?
Oh no, I think that's very, very fair to say. And what it means is, for example, that sometimes the parties just cannot talk to each other because the emotion behind it is so strong that they cannot be in the same room as each other. Which you don't normally in the commercial sphere. You might get two business partners who really start to dislike each other, and they fall out with each other. But it never generates the same level of emotion as two family members that fall out with each other, or two family members that are so fundamentally estranged because of something that has happened in that family relationship that they are unable to properly and objectively talk to each other because of the emotion that is behind it. And I've a couple of recent cases that are like that, where again, from a practical point of view, that makes resolving practical conflict between them really difficult, and actually in some cases impossible, because there's nothing I can do from a transactional or process point of view that is going to get behind that level of emotion. And I find that incredibly frustrating.
Yeah, and I'm reminded of another one, which was the other way round. The dispute didn't start in the business. So it's not a big business or anything. It was just family siblings, collectively around some dealings that they were having. But then what happened was two of the cousins, who were teenagers, fell out with each other catastrophically. And then the parents felt that they had to take their own child's side, which then filtered into their dealings and their business.
That is a not uncommon scenario, and that does happen in non-family businesses as well. And one of the early lessons I was taught in these kind of disputes was to look beyond my own client and look at their partner, find out by questioning how important their partner was into the arrangement, because a wily old litigator told me there's no point in you getting your client into the position he's going to deal with the other side if his wife's going to say, no way am I going to let you do that with that person who's messed us about so much. You've got to get them on side as well, and so that you need to look outside of your own immediate client, and even further when it's in a family business. But so often it is the case it's not that the two business partners have fallen out, but perhaps their wives have fallen out.
Yes.
And I've seen this on a couple of occasions, and that each then has to take the side of their wife, which then is brought into the business, and that's where the conflict arises. So you have your initial meetings. You're wondering why. How did this dispute? Where did this come from? This dispute. Why are they fighting so hard? And you have to. It's something completely outside of the business is causing it. And unless that is resolved or is brought into the equation of how you're going to resolve the business dispute, you're never going to get very far. You're not addressing the real cause of the problem. You're just looking at the consequences of that.
Amazing. So we're coming to the end of our time together, and it's absolutely fascinating. And there's something about you, Ed, that there's a gentleness and a kind of been around the blockness around, having seen it, and yet, not jaded by it, but very gentle and guiding. That, I'd trust you with my life, because you're just, there's a quality about you that sort of sets you apart in some way. So just as we come to leave this, if there are families out there and this is resonating, or they've got family disputes, or in their businesses or whatever, could you give a quick kind of what's the first thing they should do, or what's the first thing, 2 things or whatever that they should do? Pause this and do this.
I think the first thing to do is pause and think, what is going to happen if we don't resolve this? Because there is always a real risk that you very, very quickly move through the escalation stage of conflict. So you go from there being a possible win-win to it being a win-lose situation where one person's got to lose, the other's got to win, to a lose-lose situation. And by the time you get to the lose-lose stage of conflict, it's so difficult to resolve that. And the worst thing that can happen is that parties will simply each cut their nose off to spite their face, let the whole business go down, as long as the other party doesn't get it. And that kind of lose-lose scenario can happen very, very quickly in a family business. So the best thing to do is pause, try and take stock of what do we want to achieve here. And if that's an exit, a split, that's great. We can talk about how that's going to work. And then come to a lawyer that is going to focus on doing a deal. Now, you can choose a lawyer that portrays himself as the baddest, nastiest person in the room, who's going to take the other side to the cleaners, going to take it all the way and fight all the way. And that's fine, but you're not going to get a deal done in that kind of scenario. Or if you do, it'll be done at the doors of the court after you spend hundreds of thousands of pounds or more on it. Find a lawyer that has a constructive approach to dispute resolution, and that doesn't mean they've got to be soft or not fight your corner, but they will take a different starting point, and that's the starting point that I take.
Yes, well, I mean, it's a good question for any lawyer that says that they're going to get you all this money and victory, is how much will it cost and how long will it take?
Yes, And the answer to that is always very easy. It'll cost an awful lot of money and
Yeah.
it'll take longer than you think it will.
Yeah, absolutely. So if anybody wanted to find you, where would they find you, Ed? Because I can imagine people saying, "Oh, I really like that guy."
Easy to Google, Ed Weeks at Cripps,
Ed Weeks
and
at Cripps.
I'll pop up. I've written a book on the subject of disputes in family businesses that you can get via Amazon.
Oh,
So
tell us the name of the book.
it is a practical guide to shareholder disputes in family businesses.
Amazing.
And it's not a very technical book, although it has some technical stuff in it, but it is written in a fairly light fashion so that non-lawyers can follow it as well as lawyers.
Amazing. This has been a really wonderful time with you. It's felt really like so much information, and yet, in a really gentle and considered way. Thank you so much for giving us your time, and I look forward to speaking to you again.
It's been a real pleasure. Thank you very much.
Thank you.